This episode is in partnership with Authority Magazine. Authority Magazine, a Medium publication, is devoted to sharing in-depth and interesting interviews featuring people who are authorities in business, pop culture, wellness, social impact, and tech.
Using interviews to draw out stories that are both empowering and actionable. Authority Magazine believes that good stories should feel beautiful to the mind, heart, and eyes. It's as if the older generation and younger generation can't quite see eye to eye.
From Johnny Cochran's Summertime Blues to The Who's My Generation, there's always been a generation gap.
But with today's Gen Z, some say it's time to connect, provide empathy, and grow independence.
Today we welcome Dr. Tim Elmore, the founder of Growing Leaders. Tim, welcome to Believe in People.
Thank you. Great to be with you guys.
Listen, even me, we were all young once. There always has been discussion of the gap between our elders, our parents, however you want to refer to it by. Why are you particularly concerned with today's youth, who many people refer to as Gen Z, whatever that means?
Yeah, or fragile snowflakes, right?
Okay.
Yeah, the generation gap term actually emerged from Life magazine editor John Poppy way back in the 1960s when the baby boomers were the new kids on the block. And of course, now the boomers are the seniors, going kids today. So it cycles through, and it's been doing this since Socrates. I don't know if you know this, but Socrates even wrote that kids in his day were disrespectful to their parents and they need to listen more. And I thought, oh my gosh, he could be living today. So here's why I'm especially concerned that we pay attention to this issue today. When I was growing up, and I'm going to date myself now, I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. We had one screen in our house, and it was a television. In fact, in my house, it was a black and white TV. We all gathered around the television set and we watched a program, we called it I Love Lucy or Dick Van Dyke or something like that. We watched together, we laughed together, and we talked about it afterwards together. Fast forward to today, we've all got our own screens, do we not, in our hands, and we can be in echo chambers or silos with our own people who think like we do, talk like we do, vote like we do. And it's not done a good thing for our connections between generations. So the old folk think that these Gen Zers are, like I said, fragile snowflakes or narcissistic or whatever. And of course, the kids think we're, stubborn dinosaurs. But there's so much value each generation can add to the other. So I'm on a mad pursuit to wave a flag and say, let's listen to each other and let's leverage the strengths that each generation has for one another. So that's my goal.
And so, and I have so many questions to ask you, Tim, but I guess the first question is, could you define Gen Z, and then what led you to really, you've articulated your interest in working with them, but how did that evolve for you to want to work with Gen Z?
Good question, Amy. So let me start with the evolution first, and then I'll talk about what we know about them and who they are. I started as a teacher way back in 1980. So there you go. I'm one of the dinosaurs. But I was still young myself, obviously, back then. But I realized at that point, I want to devote my life to connecting with young people because I thought they're our future. If we equip them and prepare them well, we'll be able to stand on their shoulders one day when we can no longer stand on anyone's shoulders. So Gen Z, well, I'll tell you how it evolved. By 1983, I started working with Dr. John C. Maxwell. So I don't know if you know that name, but John is a leadership guru and best-selling author and considered a leadership expert, really globally. But my love of leadership merged with my love of the next generation, students, kids. So when I started working, it was the late baby boomers still coming through the school system. Then it was the Xers, Gen Xers. Then it was the millennials. We've been throwing them under the bus for 15 years now. And now it's Gen Z. And to be quite honest with you, the youngest children that we're measuring today are the alpha generation. They would be in elementary school and younger. And They're growing up in a very crazy world, aren't they? Think about it. If you're 6 years old, half your life's been a pandemic, and much of that's been a quarantine. So they need to be socialized. We need to help them catch up socially and academically, but that's a whole nother podcast, maybe for another day. But Gen Z would be young adults. They would be middle school, high school, college, and even young professionals. And I really believe in them, but they are so fundamentally different than their predecessors because they grew up in such a different world. So millennials grew up with a cell phone. Gen Z's growing up with a smartphone. And wouldn't you guys agree? That's kind of been a game changer. Both the agency it gives kids, that I can learn the answer not from a grown up, but from my device, but then high anxiety as well. I think the smartphone ambushed us as adults, as parents, as caring adults. We didn't know the anxiety it would bring with kids on a device getting 10,000 messages a day. So those would be my concerns and my hopes for Gen Z.
You talk about, you used the word silo a minute ago, which I think is a really good sort of turn of phrase to describe even my own life in many ways, because this device, these devices that have now been created for us, are you suggesting that these devices that are supposed to open the world to us and therefore ergo to our children or the future generation, these devices, as opposed to opening the world, are actually making us more insular? And is that causing a problem?
Yeah, well, I think it's a paradox. Certainly they do open the world to us. So there's always a oxymoronic thing going on with smart technology. Pros and cons. The pro is it does open the world to us if we'll access the entire world, not just our silo, our people. The problem is, and we've learned this over the years, have we not, that social media sites can read who we are and they give us stuff we already agree with or that we like because they want to keep pushing us to longer hours on the screen. So instead of opening up the world, they have indeed done what you just said, Kevin. They've kind of closed it out to us. And now a parent today of a teenager may know that their daughter has an Instagram account. They have no idea she has 5 Finsta accounts, fake Instagram, where she's developing personas for her life and God knows what they are and who she's talking to. But it's just we thought we were hiding things from our parents when we were teenagers or 20-somethings. Now kids actually can, unless adults are very, very intentional about making sure that we're connecting, not just correcting. And far too often we get frustrated instead of fascinated. I use that word a lot. We're frustrated instead of fascinated by these young people. And we just go, kids today. And then we just try to become, well, here's another metaphor I use. By the time our kids become teenagers, we're more like referees and quarterbacks in our families. And so we're calling fouls and tell them they're out of bounds rather than inspiring them to move forward and score. So I'm waxing eloquent now. I'll stop there. But that's what I think has gone on far too often.
And ironically, then, because you, Tim, you mentioned that Gen Zs are the most anxious and unhappy generation, but yet they're our future. So you're an expert in this area. You're helping. You're a teacher. You're an educator, parenting. You talk about parenting, leadership. How do we guide them? What do you do? How do you suggest that we even start the conversations?
Yeah, great question. So 2 things immediately come to my mind, Amy. So I'm going to try to retrieve them. I'm old and I have senior moments. Let me try to get to two thoughts without talking like an auctioneer. First and foremost, this might be helpful to listeners. When I began to survey representatives from each of the 5 generations that are still working together, so they would be the builders that grew up during the Great Depression and World War II, the boomers who grew up post-World War II, but prior to the birth control pill, it was a boom. And then the Xers or baby busters who grew up in the late 60s all the way through the 70s. Millennials are basically 80s and 90s kids, and then Gen Z would be after. What I found is when I asked the question, what do you want most when people from other generations interact with you? Well, you can imagine all the generations had their pet peeves and their wishes, but 3 items came up from every generation. In other words, I want them to do this with me when they interact with me. Here they are. Number 1, this is so interesting to me, humility. I wish the older
Wow.
people, when they interacted with me, would not start with ego or let me share a few things. When I was your age, I marched through the snow, blah, blah, blah. So humility. Think about that. When I come across with humility to a young person or a young to an old person, it screams, I realize I don't know everything. I realize I've got much to learn. It's just so important for connections. Number 2 was respect. That's predictable. Every generation said, I'd like you to start with belief and respect, not say, you got to earn my respect, Sonny. So start with respect. And then thirdly, I love this one. Every generation said, I wish you approached me with curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
So there was an eagerness to say, ooh, I bet I could pick up something from you. You're different from me. Can you imagine our world if every one of us approached the other generations with humility, respect, and curiosity? Oh my gosh, we'd have a bridge instead of a wall between the generations. And I think the sad thing, Amy, just getting back to your original question, I think far too often we think the goal at work is to tolerate each other. What a pitiful goal. I'm going to tolerate, then I'm going to retire, So that would be my first answer to that. The other real practical thing I would say, and this may be, I don't know, maybe common sense, is I always tell myself when I know I'm going to interact with some young team members at my office, I say, this is a leg I have to stand on. So it's ALEG. I need to start with letter A, ask. Instead of telling them something or teaching them something, I want to ask questions first. So I actually go into the office when I want to meet with my 20-somethings and I have questions to ask. It's just going to start with them feeling he's interested in me, and by the way, the letter L after ask is obvious. We need to listen well. When I listen to them, they feel heard. The letter E, empathize. So maybe they share a complaint or maybe they share something's wrong with the world, and they probably will. When I empathize, they not only feel heard, they feel understood. And then the letter G comes along. It's guide. But I guide them only when I've earned my right by asking questions, listening well, and empathizing. And now, again, I've earned that right. So that's what I would just say real practically. If someone was looking for a way to connect, that would be what I would say.
And isn't it interesting, though, that you could apply that a leg up. You can apply that to either the young person speaking to the older person or the older person speaking to the younger person. But let me ask you here about what your concern is, because your organization is called Growing Leaders. And I guess my question is, are you concerned that we are not growing leaders? And what should we do to correct that?
Yeah, great question. And it's a huge question that probably deserves a couple of hours. Let me see if I can do this in a couple of minutes. Yes, I am concerned because of the wall that's being built sometimes unwittingly instead of the bridge to other generations. I don't know if you know this, but age discrimination lawsuits are up in North America, and by major brands, Marriott, WeWork, IBM. Old are suing the company because they felt like they didn't get promoted because they were too old. And the young are suing the company because they felt like they didn't get promoted because they were too young. So we're resorting to legislation instead of conversation. Pardon my pithy remarks here. But I think we've got to get back to having those conversations, because right now, Generation Z, in nationwide surveys done by the Barna Research Institute, they tell us Gen Z is very concerned that there aren't enough good leaders. But in many cases, they're going, I don't see those leaders turning their power over to us anytime soon. So think about Washington, D.C. right now. Amy, I know you're in Toronto, but think about the United States. In Washington, D.C., the average age of a government worker is well into their 70s. President Biden is 80. And the major candidates in past elections, I mean, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, I mean, they're in their 70s and 80s. I'm thinking, what is going on? When do we turn it over to them? Well, we think they're not ready. Well, I'll tell you why they're not ready. We're not getting them ready. We're holding on to power. Pardon my sermon here. We're holding on to power when we ought to be saying, I need to show up now and say that in the latter half of my career, I'm about pouring into the emerging generations to get them ready. So when I retire, I can feel great about the organization that I've been a part of
Name
or the family. Yeah, go ahead.
name. Sorry to interrupt, but like, name me one big company in the world that does that.
Mm, I'm going to have to think.
Well,
Yeah,
it's a rhetorical question. I
yes, of
mean,
course. Yeah,
it's everything comes down to follow the money, or where's the money coming.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it. I guess what I'm asking is, it's ingrained in the way we are, is it not? And how are we
yeah,
going to change
yeah,
that?
yeah. Well, I think it's going to be a mindset change, a paradigm change, the way we look at things differently. So, what I often recommend is something we're doing at Growing Leaders, my organization. It's called reverse mentoring. I didn't come up with the term. Jack Welch came up with it way back in the 90s when he was at GE. But reverse mentoring is absolutely fascinating. It's where you get a senior veteran, someone that's maybe in their 50s or 60s or maybe beyond, who's been around the block a few times, meeting with a younger, perhaps recently graduated young professional. The two of them get together and they swap stories. You can always find common ground when you swap stories. How about them Cubs or whatever, that sort of thing. But then each one becomes the mentor for the other and the mentee for the other. So the older guy or gal might say, here's how to succeed at this organization. I've been around a little while and I can tell you. But then he or she takes off that mentor hat, puts on the mentee hat and says, teach me now what out of your superpowers, out of your strengths. And they might share, how you could monetize the latest social media app for marketing at the company. So in the book on this subject that I did, I talk about Tony. It's a great story. Tony, while he was finishing up college at Ohio University, got a part-time job. He was working at a major retail brand paint store. Everybody, if I said the name, you would know the brand. While he was there working part-time, he set up a TikTok account and he started filming himself mixing paints and just doing fun things at the store. And he went viral. When Tony had accumulated 1.4 million followers and 37 million views, he thought to himself, I should tell the executives here. They may want to monetize this. This could be 1 million more people they're not reaching as customers. So young Tony puts a slide deck together to make a presentation. He does not get one manager or executive interested in hearing from him. He doesn't get one set of eyeballs to look at his slide deck. Tony did get something he didn't expect. Tony got fired. Yep.
Right.
Because they were just sure he was stealing the paint or doing this on company time or probably distracting to the customers, kids today. And of course, so here's what happened. Tony gets fired. He moves down to Florida, now has over 2 million people following him, and he started his own paint store. Now, there's probably a lot to that story we don't understand for sure. But here's one thing I do understand. They missed a chance. They missed a chance had they listened instead of lectured or been so sure of themselves. And I think we got to get over it. We got to get past our own noses and say, maybe they have I have insight as an old guy. They have intuition as a young gal. So we've got to do this better. And I'm just imploring everyone listening, we've got to do this better.
And so true, Tim. So while you're working from the youth side, preparing them to get ready for, let's say, real life, so that's a whole thing in itself, and setting the expectations and understanding of what one could expect, because there's so many different experiences. Now, do you then go to leadership to say, this is here's what Gen Z needs. Here's how we all work together. And do you do that? And do they embrace this thinking?
Well, sometimes they embrace it, but usually I make my pitch. I'm almost pastoral in my approach, as I say, I beseech you. So here's a couple of good examples. During the NFL Combine a few weeks ago, I was invited undeservedly to get to speak to all of the 32 NFL teams. The directors and heads of player engagement were in a room in Indianapolis, and I got to share this kind of stuff. And they were so open because they realized the future of our ball club is in these rookies' hands. Some of these are franchise players we hope to really groom and not have them, hired and then quit, or want to trade or free agent. So I believe when a leader who's over 40 realizes, even if I don't understand them, they're our future, like it or not, that's when we get interested. Even if I don't like kids, I go, This is the future of the world. And if I'm a good leader at all, I have to realize that my job description is not finished until I get them ready. Success without a successor is a failure. That's my belief.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm going to borrow that line.
Okay.
I want to take you back at the beginning of there are two things here. One is that we've discussed how Gen Z is perhaps the most anxiety ridden generation.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, if during
Yeah.
the Second World War, the First World War, Vietnam, I mean, there's always been a lot of anxiety. Why do you think this generation is so full of anxiety? Is it because we're just being bombarded by things that aren't bombs, or what?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, think about past generations that could have and maybe should have been anxious. The Great Depression kids, World War II kids, etc. My parents were both Great Depression kids. So they were anxious back then. There were a couple of years during the 1930s that suicide rates really went up. So it did happen. Here's what's different today. We now have a news cycle. You guys know this. Look at your careers. News cycles that are 24/7. So we not only hear about the school shooting in Tennessee, we heard about it 7 times. And even though we know it's the same story, I hear it 7 times. So we're absolutely overwhelmed with tragedy. That's fact number 1. Number 2, kids are over informed. I mean, they get information far earlier than they're ready. There's a reason why movies are PG-13, rated R, etc. We know our minds are not fully ready for some of that more adult content, pardon me, but they're getting it. If they've got a phone and they're 11 or 12 or 13 and mom and dad don't know how to guide them, that phone is just overwhelming them. Even if it's not bad information, it's too much information. And then I would say the last item I would say is that I believe kids today are not only, I have a term that I use, and it's going to sound derogatory, so forgive me right up front. I believe we have a dilemma that I call artificial maturity. I did a book on this a number of years ago. Artificial maturity is not the kid's fault. It's the result of the headwinds of culture that we did not know how to navigate as bosses, parents, coaches, teachers, anybody that cares about kids. Kids are over-informed. They have more information or get information earlier than they're ready as young children, right? 90% of 4-year-olds are on a tablet, but they're underexposed to firsthand experiences later than they're ready. So adults are so safety conscious that some of the risk-taking ventures that matured past generations, they had a job at 11 years old on the farm or something like that. We want to keep, don't climb the monkey bars or don't get a job, just focus on academics. We're so safety conscious that some of the experiences that might have matured them and made them less anxious because they would have navigated the experience and thought, okay, I lived through that. I'm okay. Today, they may not even get that experience. So exposed to information, underexposed to firsthand experiences creates a maturity that looks real, but it's not really real. They may be very cognitively advanced, but socially and emotionally behind and scared as they leave the house at 18 or 22.
Yeah, and actually, that leads me to my final question is, Tim, do you think the pandemic hindered or helped us? In your opinion?
You ask great questions, Amy. I think the right answer is probably both. At least where I lived, there was a number of us that thought, "Oh my gosh, I don't have to be on a rabbit." Not a rabbit, but a gerbil hamster wheel, where I'm just, yeah, that's right. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. I speak for a living. We're on this, this wheel, and we realized, oh, I love being at home with my spouse and not working my head off or whatever. So there were some good things, but what I'm seeing is there were also some bad habits that emerged because we could just sit around. And I learned with my team, the biggest 3 enemies were the bed, the refrigerator, and the television, because they could just relax. And so there was a little of both. And I think what we need to do is take what we learned that was good and continue to replicate it, but maybe don't restart those bad habits. And that's what I would wish, especially for those entering their careers now. Hey, start the good habits now. And I'm hoping that they can and will.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, just as we do each week as we close off the program, we have a special question to ask you, and that is our show just happens to be called Believe in People. We'd be interested in knowing, why do you believe in people?
Mm. Well, I do. In fact, one of my core values is begin with belief. I really think I do better with people when I begin with belief. So I'm going to try to see the best, even if it's just that silver lining in the dark cloud. I try to see the best. But here's why I would say I do. If I look at these generations and I just see the stereotype, that's what we do. We stereotype others, don't we? So boomers are dinosaurs, Xers are just contrarian and they're jaded, millennials are narcissistic and Gen Z are fragile snowflakes. If we stop stereotyping and we start seeing the good that each generation brings, oh my gosh, I have great hope. So baby boomers bring coaching and stories from their careers. Gen Xers do bring a wonderful contrarian point of view where they may see how to shore up a problem that we didn't even see, the rest of us. Millennials bring confidence and energy to a team. What team doesn't need confidence and energy? And I think Gen Z brings a hacker mindset and an entrepreneurial spirit. Way more want to start something than join something. So I think if we see the bright side and the good side that they all bring, now we're going to be able to leverage those strengths that each one brings and maybe do something good with our organizations.
That's great. That's great. Wow, I've learned a lot. Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate your time and your understanding of these generations. It helps bring things together.
It does. It really does. And think about family reunions. We need to practice this when grandma and grandpa are here and my niece and nephew are here. So just everywhere we turn, there are more people living longer and there's more babies being born. I know I've said it already. We've got to get this right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Tim Elmore, Growing Leaders. We wish you the best of luck. Thanks so much for sharing a half hour of your time with us. Bye-bye.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for hosting me.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you so much. Kev, I found the three things that Tim mentioned that would sort of connect the generations and I really took something away with this, is humility, start with respect, and curiosity. I like those three. They work. And I hope people reflect and think about that.
Well, it's funny. I've talked to a lot of many people starting out in the career that I had in journalism. And along those lines, two of the things that I always sort of strived to get across as my ego is taking over and I'm talking down to them is that you need to be curious. You have to be curious. Otherwise, why are you doing what you do? The other one is you have to listen. You can't go in to a conversation with a preconceived idea of what it is supposed to be about. You've got to listen. And if you're curious and you listen, who knows? Maybe the kid will listen back. Let's hope. And, by the way, I found that to be a very hopeful conversation with Dr. Tim. And if you want to hear another podcast filled with hope, well, listen to our podcast, Believe in People, next week, because we do this every week. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, everyone.